In the winter of 1941, within the cold, wood-paneled walls of the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler sat surrounded by maps of the Atlantic, expressing nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt for the United States. To Hitler, America was not a superpower. It was a mongrel society of merchants and jazz players, a nation he believed was too racially divided and culturally shallow to ever sustain a total war. He often ranted to his inner circle, staring at photographs of New York's skyscrapers, claiming they were monuments to greed rather than strength. He looked at the charts of the U.S. Navy and laughed, convinced that the soft Americans, obsessed with luxury and comfort, would never have the stomach to cross the ocean and face the hardened warriors of the Wehrmacht. This was the foundation of his ruin, a deep-seated racial arrogance that blinded him to the reality that he was not just fighting a military, but an industrial engine that had yet to even start. He treated the entry of the U.S. into the war as a minor nuisance, a belief that would eventually turn his Atlantic fortress into a graveyard of broken steel and shattered dreams.
On December 11, 1941, Hitler stood before a giant world map that covered an entire wall of his war room. With a golden pencil in his hand, he traced the immense distance between Berlin and Washington, mocking the very idea of American intervention. While his generals whispered in the corners about the catastrophic dangers of a two-front war, Hitler's arrogance flared. He believed that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had permanently crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, leaving the Americans begging for mercy and trapped within their own borders. In his map room, he analyzed the weakness of the American coastline, convinced that his U-boats would starve the U.S. into isolation before they could even mobilize a single division. He didn't see the American worker, he saw a ghost of a nation. This declaration of war was the ultimate act of underestimation, the moment a European dictator decided to challenge a nation that could outproduce his entire continent in a matter of months. He was convinced that the Atlantic was an impassable moat for the Americans, but for the Germans it was an open door to victory. He could not have been more wrong.
As reports began to filter into the Berghof about American industrial quotas, Hitler and his inner circle treated the numbers like works of fiction or Jewish fairy tales. He sat at his heavy oak desk, pushing aside thick dossiers on the Victory program, the American plan to build an impossible 60,000 aircraft in a single year. Hitler scoffed at the paper, calling it Yankee bluff and crude propaganda designed to scare him. He was so convinced of German engineering superiority, the belief that one Tiger tank was worth 1,000 crude American machines, that he believed no American factory could ever match the quality of a Krupp-made tank or a Messerschmitt fighter. He looked at the blueprints of the American Liberty ships and called them tins of sardines or disposable boats, refusing to believe that any nation could build a transport ship in just 5 days. His arrogance prevented him from seeing that while Germany was handcrafting weapons like clockwork, America was about to overwhelm him with an ocean of mass-produced steel that would drown the Reich in sheer volume.
In a tense meeting with Admiral Raeder, Hitler pointed aggressively at a blue-tinted naval chart of the Atlantic, dismissing the threat of American troop convoys as a physical impossibility. "The Americans will never reach Europe," he proclaimed with a smug smile. "My U-boats will turn the Atlantic into a German lake, a slaughterhouse for Yankee ships." He fundamentally underestimated the American capacity for logistical innovation and their scientific cooperation with the British. He couldn't conceive of a nation that could build artificial harbors, mass-produce sonar, or supply millions of men across 3,000 miles of salt water. In his mind, the ocean was a barrier that protected him from the American plague. In reality, it was a highway for the arsenal of democracy. He analyzed the sea lanes with the eyes of a man stuck in the trench warfare of 1914, failing to realize that American industrial might was already building the thousands of escort ships and long-range bombers that would soon make his invincible U-boat fleet a collection of iron coffins on the ocean floor.
Hitler often stood before photos of American recruits at the New York World Fair or on training grounds, mocking their lack of Prussian discipline and militaristic spirit. He analyzed the training manuals of the U.S. Army that his intelligence officers brought him, and he called them Scoutmaster tactics for boys, convinced that the American citizen soldier would break and flee the moment they faced the fanatical, death-defying devotion of the SS. He underestimated the resilience of a free people, believing that democracy made men weak, indecisive, and fearful of death. In his war room, he looked at troop strength estimates and laughed at the inexperienced American generals, whom he considered to be mere businessmen in uniforms. He failed to see that these merchants and farmers were backed by a logistical tail that provided every single soldier with more firepower, more food, and more mobility than any German Lanzer could dream of. His arrogance convinced him that the battle would be won by ancient notions of warrior will, while the Americans were proving it would be won by industrial weight and logistical precision.
While German generals on the Eastern Front were desperately struggling with horse-drawn supply wagons and freezing railway lines, Hitler sat in Berlin analyzing intelligence reports of American motorization with total cynical disbelief. He looked at the statistics of the Red Ball Express, the massive American trucking operation that moved thousands of tons of supplies a day, and dismissed it as an industrial impossibility. He couldn't comprehend a military that moved entirely on wheels and tracks, without a single horse in sight. His arrogance led him to believe that German handcrafted quality would always overcome American crude quantity. He analyzed the blueprints of the M4 Sherman tank and mocked its high silhouette and thin armor, calling it a Ronson lighter that would burn at the first touch. He failed to realize that for every Tiger tank he built, the Americans could build 100 Shermans. He underestimated the American philosophy of good enough for mass production, which allowed the U.S. to flood every battlefield with a crushing superiority of materiel that no amount of German valor or superior engineering could ever hope to stop. By 1943, the maps in Hitler's headquarters began to tell a terrifying story of burning cities, but he refused to read the lines of fire. He saw the red circles on the map indicating American-built B-17 bombers hitting the heart of German industry, yet he told Hermann Göring that the Americans could only build refrigerators and vacuum cleaners, not airplanes. He underestimated the American air doctrine of daylight precision bombing, believing that his flak towers and superior Luftwaffe pilots would sweep the cowardly Americans from the sky. He sat in his office, analyzing the production charts of the Ford Willow Run plant, a factory that was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour, and he called it an American fairy tale designed to deceive him. This was the core of his hubris, the total inability to admit that the inferior Americans had achieved a level of industrial coordination and mass production that made the Nazi economy look like a disorganized medieval workshop. He continued to demand luxury jets, while the Americans were drowning him in a flood of standardized bombers. When the Americans landed in North Africa during Operation Torch, Hitler stood before his Mediterranean charts in a state of genuine, panicked shock. He had underestimated the American ability to project such massive power so far from their own shores, believing they were still licking their wounds from Pearl Harbor. He turned to Rommel and Kesselring, demanding to know how these amateurs had managed such a logistical feat without him knowing. Even then, his arrogance didn't break. He refused to commit the necessary resources to Tunisia, believing the Americans would run home like children after their first defeat at Kasserine Pass. He analyzed the battlefield reports with a smug satisfaction after that initial victory, calling the American soldiers disorganized rabble. He failed to see that the Americans were the fastest-learning military in history. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that North Africa was not just a sideshow, but a laboratory where the U.S. Army was perfecting the art of combined arms and crushing the Wehrmacht with a level of fire support the Germans couldn't even imagine.
In the secret signal rooms of the Reich, Hitler's technicians analyzed the security of the Enigma machine daily, assuring the Führer with absolute certainty that it was mathematically impossible for the Americans or British to break their codes. Hitler's arrogance embraced this technical superiority. He underestimated American and British scientific and academic collaboration, believing that pure German logic could never be defeated by Anglo-Saxon tinkering. He sat at his desk, signing off on naval plans and troop movements that were already being read in real time by intelligence officers in Washington and Bletchley Park. Because he believed he was intellectually superior to the decadent Westerners, he never once questioned the security of his own communications. This underestimation allowed the Americans to steer their massive convoys around his U-boat wolf packs and strike his supply lines with surgical, deadly precision, all while Hitler sat in his bunker, believing he was the undisputed master of the silent war of the airwaves.
Hitler's obsession with the oil of the Caucasus was driven by his growing fear of the American oil machine, yet his response was born of desperation and hubris. He stood over a map of the Baku oil fields, telling his generals that if they didn't get Russian oil, the American-funded Soviets would overwhelm them. Yet he fundamentally underestimated the American ability to supply the entire Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. He looked at the maps of the Persian corridor and the Arctic convoys, convinced that a few heroic U-boat attacks could cut the American lifeline. He failed to see the reality. The Americans were producing more oil in a single week in Texas and Oklahoma than Germany could dream of capturing in a year in Russia. His arrogance led him to chase the black gold of the East, sacrificing an entire army at Stalingrad, while the American oil industry was already fueling a three-front war that was slowly but surely strangling the Reich. He was fighting for a drop of oil, while the Americans were swimming in an ocean of it.
As the tide turned in 1944, the atmosphere in the map room became one of delusional, drug-fueled fantasy. Hitler stood over a map of his Atlantic Wall, still mocking the American cowardice and lack of experience in amphibious landings. He analyzed the photos of the Mulberry artificial harbors, engineering marvels, and called them absurd toys that would wash away in the first storm. He underestimated the American combat engineer as much as he underestimated the American infantryman. He sat with his generals, moving tiny wooden blocks representing ghost divisions that had no tanks, no fuel, and no men, while across the English Channel, the most well-supplied and motorized army in human history was preparing to prove his impregnable wall was nothing but a pile of concrete. His arrogance had reached its absolute peak. He had spent 4 years underestimating a giant, and now that giant was standing on his doorstep, armed with a sledgehammer of industrial power, ready to kick the door down and end the dream of the Reich forever.
The story of Hitler's war with America is the story of a man who broke his own pencils, trying to redraw a reality he simply didn't like. He underestimated the industrial might, the technological genius, and the iron, unyielding will of a nation he had dismissed as decadent and racially inferior. He sat in his bunker at the very end, analyzing maps of a Berlin that was being turned to white-hot rubble by American bombs, still wondering how the merchants and jazz players had beaten the warrior elite of Germany. He couldn't accept that the Americans had outproduced, outthought, and outfought him at every turn. The lesson of 1945 is a cold, hard one. In the age of total industrial war, arrogance is a fatal luxury that no leader can afford. Hitler had underestimated the power of freedom and the sheer strength of the American factory. And in the end, the sleeping giant he had so arrogantly awakened didn't just defeat him, it erased his 1,000-year dream from the map of the world and rewrote history in American steel.